Is this some kind of joke? The voice came from gate 47, sharp with irritation. Kyle Richardson, a junior ground operations supervisor barely 3 months into the job, stood with his arms crossed, staring at the baggage claim slip in his hand. Flight 447 to Miami was scheduled to depart in 20 minutes, and apparently, someone's luggage had been loaded onto the wrong plane. Again. Frank Morrison stood beside the baggage cart, his reflective orange vest worn and faded, his company ID badge clipped to a lanyard around his neck. At 66, he moved with the careful economy of motion that came from decades of physical work. His hair was gray, cropped short, and his face had the weathered quality of a man who'd spent years in airports, breathing recycled air and diesel fumes. "It's not a joke, sir," Frank said quietly. "The bag with the red tag, that's a priority item. Medication's inside. It needs to be on this flight." "Then why is it still sitting here?" Kyle gestured at the lone suitcase on Frank's cart. "Flight's boarding. The cargo hold is sealed. You should have caught this 20 minutes ago." "I did catch it, but the system logged it for the wrong flight. I'm trying to fix it." Kyle let out an exasperated sigh. "Look, I don't have time for this. You're a baggage handler. Your job is to move bags, not make decisions about priority items. I'll handle it." "With respect, sir, if that bag doesn't make it on this flight, someone's going to have a medical emergency in Miami without their insulin." "Then they should have checked their luggage earlier." Kyle pulled out his radio. "Ground ops, this is Richardson. I need approval to reopen cargo on flight 447. The radio crackled. "Negative, Richardson. Flight's pushing back in 15. We're not delaying for one bag." Kyle looked at Frank with barely concealed smugness. "There you go. Company policy. The bag goes on the next flight." Frank looked at the suitcase, then at gate 47, where passengers were still trickling onto the jetway. He made a decision. "I'll hand-deliver it. Through the cabin. Stow it in the overhead bin." "You can't do that. You're ground crew. You're not cleared to board." "I have clearance. It's still active in the system." "From what? When did you ever need cabin access?" Frank didn't answer. He grabbed the suitcase, hoisted it onto his shoulder, a practiced motion that belied his age, and walked toward the gate agent. Kyle followed, protesting, but Frank was already showing his badge to the agent, explaining the situation. After a moment's hesitation and a quick radio check, she waved him through. "Make it quick," she said. "We're closing the door." Frank walked down the jetway, the suitcase balanced on his shoulder. Behind him, Kyle was still complaining into his radio about insubordinate baggage handlers. Frank ignored him. He'd heard worse from better people. The aircraft was a Boeing 737, single aisle, maybe 150 passengers. Frank stepped aboard, nodded to the flight attendant at the door, and began making his way down the aisle toward business class, where the passenger with the medical luggage was seated. He was halfway there when he noticed the man in 12C. The man was in his 30s, wearing a business suit, his hair neatly combed. Nothing obviously wrong. But Frank had spent 22 years reading people on airplanes, and something about this man's posture was off. Too rigid, too alert. His eyes tracked every movement in the cabin with the hyper-awareness of someone expecting trouble. Frank filed it away and continued forward. He found the passenger with the medical luggage, a woman in her 50s who looked relieved and grateful, and helped her stow the bag in the overhead compartment. "Thank you so much," she said. "My doctor said if I miss even one dose." "You're all set now, ma'am. Have a safe flight." He turned to head back to the exit. The flight attendant was already preparing to close the door. But as Frank walked past 12C again, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The man's jacket had shifted slightly when he reached for his seatbelt. Underneath, clipped to his belt, was the unmistakable outline of a holster. And not just any holster, a specific model used by federal law enforcement. The man wasn't a threat. He was an Air Marshal. Which meant there was probably a reason an Air Marshal was on this specific flight. Frank's mind, trained by 2 decades of counter-terrorism work, began cataloging details. He scanned the cabin with practiced subtlety. There, 2 rows back, a man in 14A. Mid-20s, nervous energy, kept glancing at his watch. And across the aisle, 14F, another man, similar age, similar energy. They weren't traveling together according to the seating chart, but they were coordinated. Small tells. The way they both adjusted their positions at the same moment. The way their eyes briefly met and looked away. Frank's heart rate didn't change. His expression remained neutral. But his mind was racing through scenarios, threat assessments, contingency plans. He'd done this 1,000 times before, just not as a baggage handler. He continued walking toward the exit, but as he passed the galley, he caught the eye of the lead flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with a name tag that read Sarah. He gave her a subtle gesture, the kind that meant nothing to passengers but everything to crew who'd been trained to watch for it. She stepped into the galley with him, her smile professional, but her eyes questioning. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly. "That man in 12C, he's an Air Marshal, correct?" Sarah's expression flickered with surprise. "How did you—" "I need you to listen very carefully. Don't react. Don't look around. There are at least 2 passengers on this flight who are exhibiting pre-operational behavior consistent with hijacking protocol. Rows 14, seats A and F. Who are you?" "Right now, I'm a baggage handler. 10 minutes ago, I was Federal Air Marshal Frank Morrison, retired. Badge number 729. You can verify that with TSA if we had time, but we don't." Sarah's face went pale. "Should I alert the captain?" "Not yet. If they're monitoring crew communications, that could trigger early action. Where's your other Air Marshal positioned?" "I don't know what you're—" "Sarah, I did your job for 22 years. I know there's at least 1 Air Marshal on every international flight and most domestic ones. The man in 12C is one. Where's his partner?" She hesitated, then whispered, "I was told there's only 1 today. Budget cuts." Frank processed this. 1 Air Marshal. At least 2 potential hijackers. Bad odds. "I need you to do something for me. Tell the captain there's a maintenance issue. Something minor. A overhead bin latch. A seat mechanism. Something that requires a ground crew member to check before takeoff. That gives me a legitimate reason to stay on board." "But the door is still open. We haven't pushed back. Make the call." Sarah looked at him, weighing the decision. Frank could see her calculating the risk. Was this old man delusional, or was he the real deal? Then she nodded and picked up the phone to the cockpit. 90 seconds later, Frank was officially inspecting an overhead bin near the front of the cabin while the departure was delayed. The passengers grumbled. Kyle Richardson was probably having an aneurysm at the gate, but Frank now had eyes on the entire cabin. He confirmed his initial assessment. 2 men, mid-20s, Middle Eastern features, traveling separately but coordinated. They weren't exhibiting obvious terrorist behavior. No religious recitations, no suspicious bulges. But their micro-expressions, their stress indicators, the way they kept glancing at the cockpit door. Frank had seen it before. The Air Marshal in 12C had noticed them too. Frank could see it in the way the man's posture had shifted, the way his right hand had moved closer to his weapon. But the Marshal was 1 row behind and across the aisle from one suspect, and 4 rows away from the other. If something happened, he couldn't cover both simultaneously. Frank made another decision. He moved down the aisle, still carrying his inspection clipboard, and deliberately stumbled as he passed 12C, catching himself on the armrest. "Sorry about that," he said loudly. Then, as he straightened, he whispered, "Badge 729, retired. 2 suspects, 14A and F. You see them?" The Marshal's eyes widened fractionally. He gave the barest nod. "I'm staying aboard," Frank continued, still pretending to check his clipboard. "Cover F. I'll take A if they move." "You're not authorized." "Neither are they. Your call." Before the Marshal could respond, the PA system crackled. The captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for pushback. Flight attendants, prepare doors for departure." It was happening. The flight was leaving, and Frank Morrison, officially a baggage handler, was still on board. The door sealed with a heavy thunk. The jetway pulled away. The aircraft began to push back from the gate. Frank took a seat in the jump seat near the front galley, the one flight attendants used during taxi. Sarah gave him a look that was equal parts grateful and terrified. He gave her a reassuring nod. For the next 10 minutes, nothing happened. The plane taxied to the runway. Passengers settled in, opening magazines, checking phones before the signal to turn them off. The two suspects remained in their seats, seemingly calm. Then, as the aircraft turned onto the runway and the engines spooled up for takeoff, Frank saw 14F reach into his jacket pocket. Everything that happened next happened in seconds, but Frank's mind broke it down into frame-by-frame clarity, the way it always had during critical incidents. The man in 14F pulled out what looked like a phone, but Frank's trained eye caught the anomaly. The device was too thick, the weight distribution wrong. It wasn't a phone, it was a trigger. At the same moment, 14A stood up abruptly. "I need the bathroom!" he shouted, his voice too loud, too urgent. A distraction. The Air Marshal in 12C was already moving, rising from his seat, his hand moving toward his weapon. But he was focused on 14A, the immediate threat, the man moving toward the cockpit. Which meant 14F was unsecured. Frank launched himself from the jump seat. He covered the distance in 3 strides. Passengers gasped, someone screamed, and his hand clamped down on 14F's wrist just as the man's thumb moved toward the device's activation button. "Federal Air Marshal," Frank said, his voice calm but carrying authority. It wasn't technically true anymore, but in this moment, it was the only thing that mattered. "Drop the device." 14F's eyes went wide with shock. He tried to pull away, but Frank's grip was iron. Years of grappling training, scenario drills, muscle memory, it all came flooding back. "Drop it now or I break your wrist." Behind him, Frank could hear the other Air Marshal engaging with 14A. Shouting, passengers screaming, the chaos of a confrontation in a confined space. But Frank couldn't look away from 14F. The man was making a choice. Comply or trigger whatever that device was meant to do. "You're making a mistake," 14F hissed. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You're part of a coordinated action. Your partner is a distraction. You're the payload. That device triggers something, probably an improvised explosive in the cargo hold or a chemical dispersal system in the ventilation. Drop it." The plane was still accelerating down the runway. The captain hadn't been alerted yet. If Frank was wrong, if this was all some massive misunderstanding, his career, what was left of it, was over. But if he was right and did nothing, everyone on this plane was dead. 14F's thumb twitched toward the button. Frank didn't hesitate. He applied pressure to the specific nerve cluster in the man's wrist, a technique taught to air marshals for disarming threats without using lethal force. The man's hand spasmed open involuntarily. The device dropped. Frank caught it with his free hand, set it carefully on the empty seat, and in one fluid motion, spun 14F around and forced him face down into his own seat, arm twisted behind his back in a control hold. "Sarah," Frank called to the flight attendant. "Zip ties, now!" She was already moving, pulling the restraints from the emergency kit. Within seconds, 14F was secured, his hands bound behind him, unable to move. Frank picked up the device carefully. It was a modified smartphone, but the internal components were all wrong. Wires ran to a small battery pack, and there was a transmitter. Remote detonation device. His assessment had been correct. The cockpit door flew open. The captain, a man in his 50s with captain's bars on his shoulders, stood there with a fire extinguisher raised like a weapon. Behind him, Frank could see the co-pilot at the controls, still managing the takeoff. "What the hell is going on?" the captain demanded. "This flight is not taking off," Frank said. "Abort, now." "Who are you two?" "Frank Morrison, Federal Air Marshal, retired, badge 729. You have 2 hijack suspects on board, 1 in custody, 1 being restrained by your active marshal. And you have at least 1 explosive device that's been smuggled into either cargo or ventilation. Abort this takeoff immediately." The captain stared at him for one long second. Then training took over. He turned back to the cockpit. Abort takeoff. Ground stop. Emergency. Inform tower we have a security incident. The engines powered down. The plane decelerated rapidly, throwing passengers forward in their seats. People were screaming, crying, demanding explanations. But Frank's focus was on the device in his hand and the man zip-tied in front of him. Who else? Frank asked quietly. How many more? 14F just smiled. You're too late. It's already done. Frank's blood went cold. He looked at Sarah. Get everyone off this plane. Emergency evacuation. Right now. She didn't argue. She grabbed the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, emergency evacuation. Leave all belongings. Move to the exits now. The emergency slides deployed with explosive force. Passengers began flooding out, some panicking, some eerily calm in shock. Frank helped direct the evacuation while keeping one eye on 14F. The Air Marshal from 12C appeared, dragging 14A in restraints. His name tag read, Martinez. He looked at Frank with a mixture of respect and confusion. Who the hell are you? Long story. Did he say anything? Just kept saying we're too late. What does that mean? Frank looked at the device again. Then it hit him. It's not on this plane. It's already in the terminal. The terminal evacuation was massive. Every gate cleared. Thousands of passengers herded into parking lots. Bomb squads swept the building floor by floor. TSA locked down all checkpoints. They found the device 90 minutes later, hidden in a maintenance closet near Gate 32, disguised as HVAC equipment. 20 pounds of homemade explosives rigged to a timer. The bomb squad disarmed it with 8 minutes to spare. If the plane had taken off as scheduled, if Frank hadn't been on board, if the device in 14F's hand had been activated, the terminal bomb would have detonated during chaos. Casualties would have been catastrophic. FBI Special Agent Victoria Chen found Frank sitting on a baggage cart in the secure area, still wearing his orange vest, drinking vending machine coffee. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, and had Frank's entire file on her tablet. Frank Morrison, she said, sitting beside him. 22 years Federal Air Marshal, retired 3 years ago. 47 confirmed threat interdictions. 3 attempted hijackings prevented. 2 commendations for valor. She looked up. And now you push luggage carts. Pays the bills. You saved approximately 2,000 lives today. The terminal bomb alone would have killed hundreds. You stopped it. Martinez stopped it. I just noticed something off. Don't downplay it. You identified a coordinated terrorist attack based on behavioral tells. You violated protocols to stay on that plane. You physically disarmed a suspect during takeoff acceleration. She paused. Why did you retire? Frank sipped his coffee. I got tired. Of what? Of flying. Of sitting in seats, watching passengers, waiting for the next threat. 22 years of waiting for the worst to happen. I wanted something simple. Something without hypervigilance. So I took a job moving bags. Physical work. No life or death decisions. And yet here you are. Here I am. Chen closed her tablet. The suspects are talking. Khalid and Nasir Rahman, brothers. Part of a domestic terror cell, radicalized online. The device you took was the remote trigger. It would have signaled the terminal bomb. Maximum chaos. Hijack the plane, detonate the terminal, overwhelm emergency response. Are there others? We're running down their contacts, but these 2 were the operational team. Because of you, they're in custody, and their network is being rolled up. Because of Martinez. He engaged first. Martinez wrote that you identified the threat pattern before he did. You moved like someone who'd done this 100 times. She smiled. He also said you're probably the reason he's alive. Khalid had a ceramic knife hidden. If you hadn't taken down Nasir when you did, Khalid would have attacked Martinez from behind. Frank hadn't known that. He nodded slowly. The agency wants to give you a commendation. Maybe bring you back as a consultant. training new marshals. I appreciate it, but no. Why not? Because this was an accident. I was delivering a bag. I saw something wrong and reacted. That's not the same as going back to active duty. I don't want to spend every flight waiting for threats. I'm done. Chen stood. You can retire from the job. You can change careers. But you can't retire from who you are. You're wired for this. Today proved it. Maybe. But today was also exhausting. And I'm 66. I'd like to finish my career without any more excitement. She handed him her card. If you change your mind, call me. After she left, Kyle Richardson, the junior supervisor who'd given Frank grief, approached cautiously. His earlier arrogance was gone. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to apologize. For earlier, I didn't know. There was nothing to know. You were doing your job. I called you insubordinate. I threatened to write you up. And I ignored you and did what needed to be done. We both acted according to our training. Frank stood, finishing his coffee. Did you learn anything? Kyle nodded. Don't assume people are only what their job title says they are. Good lesson. 1 week later, Frank Morrison was back at work, moving baggage carts across the tarmac. The airport had returned to normal. The story had made national news, but Frank declined all interviews. He was just a baggage handler in the right place at the right time. As he loaded bags, a pilot walking past stopped and saluted him. Frank nodded back. Small recognitions happened occasionally now. But mostly, people just saw an old man in an orange vest doing manual labor. And that was exactly how Frank wanted it. Some people spend their careers chasing big moments. Frank had lived through enough of them. Now he pushed carts, breathed fresh air, and went home each night without the weight of 200 lives on his shoulders. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more stories of quiet masters who prove that you can walk away from a calling, but the calling never quite walks away from you.